Pretty much everyone knows the story of Noah's Ark. God decides to flood the whole earth to punish humans for their wickedness. He selects Noah and his family as the sole survivors, right? He instructs them to build a massive boat, to gather animals inside it, and then for 40 days and 40 nights, it rains and the floodwaters rise. When the floodwaters finally recede, Noah's Ark comes to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Noah releases a dove, which returns with an olive branch, signifying that the flood had ended. God promises never to do that again. He puts a big rainbow in the sky, like, sorry, but here I made this pretty thing for you. And then Noah and the animals go about repopulating the earth. It's one of the most well-known religious stories, prominent in the Christian Bible, the Jewish Torah, and also the Muslim Quran. But did you know, it doesn't end there. I mean, it would make sense if it did, right? All three of those religions actually share the same beginnings. They all trace back to Abraham. Christianity branches off with the birth of Christ in the 1st century, and then Islam branches off with the birth of Muhammad in the 7th century. But until then, they were all one religion. So it makes sense that the story of Noah is shared between them. What doesn't make sense is that almost every other major culture or religion that we know of has almost the same flood myth. The ancient Babylonians, the Greeks, Hindu, Buddhist, Aztec, Chinese, Norse, Aboriginal Australian, various Native American groups, and the list goes on and on. This story is everywhere. But is it just a freakishly common legend, a recurring myth meant to teach a lesson? Or did it actually happen? Let's fix that. Hello, I'm LaFountaine, and you're listening to History Fix, where I discuss lesser-known true stories from history you won't be able to stop thinking about. I am back at you this week with both audio and video versions of History Fix. So if you missed that announcement last week, you can find the video version of History Fix on YouTube at History Fix Podcast or over on Patreon, which is patreon.com/historyfixpodcast. Check it out while it's still a thing, because we'll see how long this actually lasts. I still can't stop thinking, okay, I keep thinking about it, way back when I did the Great Pyramid episode. This was like episode 10, okay? Long time ago, still thinking about it. So if you missed that episode, go back and check that one out for sure. But I stumbled upon a sort of fringe theory, well, multiple fringe theories, but one in particular based on some geological evidence that the Sphinx was at one time submerged in water. So the Sphinx is like that big lion man head statue thing that sits like right in front of the Great Pyramids in the middle of the desert, right? But around its base is evidence of water erosion, where water is like eating away at the rock. And so some people point to that and they say, hey, look, there was water here at one point. Now, there's a lot of debate over whether there was water there when the Sphinx was carved, like after it was carved or long before that, and then the evidence is just kind of still seen in the rock layers after they actually carve it. Either way, there was water there at one point. That desert was under a layer of water. And that's very interesting when you consider how many different ancient cultures report some form of massive flood event. But also, important to note, these cultures aren't writing about the flood, this great flood, like as it's happening. Okay, none of them are doing that. In all of these stories, it was something that happened a long, long time ago. It was a story that was passed down word of mouth and then eventually written down. Creationist author James Perloff analyzed over 200 flood myths, and he noted that 95% of them mentioned a global flood, 70% involved a boat of some kind, and in over 50% of them, the survivors end up on a mountain. Now, Perloff is a creationist author. He's trying to prove that the Noah's Ark story from the Bible actually happened, like verbatim, right, as it's written. So, factor that in when considering those stats. Stats can be misleading, but there are enough obvious similarities between these various flood myths that we have to consider them. I've talked about this before. To really prove that something happened in history, you need one of two things, or ideally both. The best evidence is physical evidence. You need proof, like what Scott Dawson and Dr. Mark Horton have found on Hatteras Island with the hammer scale, right? Evidence of a late 16th century blacksmith forge proving that English settlers were there for an extended period of time. The other thing, which isn't as good as that, is accounts coming from different sources, right? If just one guy writes it down, it's like, well, he might have just completely made that up. But if you have various sources that don't have any contact with each other, especially writing things down, they're not getting the story from one another. They're independently reporting it. Bonus points if they have nothing to gain from reporting it, but that's pretty rare. Motives tend to run deep with humans. So we definitely have the latter here. We have the Noah's Ark story shared by Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which makes sense. They were all sort of one thing at the time of Noah. But we also have a very similar story being told by the ancient Babylonians in the same area, the Epic of Gilgamesh, recorded on 12 stone tablets. This is one of the first examples of literature ever found. The story's almost identical to that of Noah, except the guy's name was Utnapishtim. It's actually more of a poem than a story, like a very early epic poem. And in the poem, Gilgamesh, who was a Sumerian king, he goes on a quest to discover how to become immortal. He had like this dear friend of his die, and he's grieving, and he doesn't want to die. He wants to become immortal. So he goes on this quest, and he meets Utnapishtim. And he tells him the story about how he gained his own immortality, right? He's immortal. Here's how I did it. He tells Gilgamesh. And the story he tells is basically the story of Noah. Utnapishtim says he was granted immortality after building a ship and surviving a great flood. Just like Noah, he brought all of his relatives and all of the animal species on Earth aboard his ship in order to repopulate the Earth after the flood had ended. The Greek version is also very similar. Zeus is displeased with the humans and decides to wipe them out and start over. So he tells a guy named Deucalion to build an ark for himself and his wife Pyrrha, who also happens to be his cousin. They do this. Zeus floods the earth for 9 days, and then afterwards the ark comes to rest on Mount Parnassus, which is in central Greece. It's like 1,500 miles away from Mount Ararat, which is where Noah's Ark was supposed to land. So it's not like close or anything. The story differs slightly at this point, though. Okay, so in order to repopulate the earth, Deucalion and his wife are instructed to throw stones over their shoulders. Lindley Keep, writing for PBS, explains, quote, "The stones thrown by Deucalion became men, and those thrown behind Pyrrha became women, which was a relatively tidy and magical way to explain the repopulation of the earth while skirting the whole incest issue," end quote. In the Hindu version, Noah's name is Manu, and he is visited not by God, but by a fish. Although in some tellings, the fish was actually the deity Vishnu. Same deal though, the fish tells Manu that the earth is going to be destroyed by a flood. Manu builds a boat and ties it to the horn of the great fish. Which, do fish have horns? I don't know. The fish guides the boat through the flood and predictably to the top of a great mountain where Manu performs a ritual sacrifice by pouring butter and sour milk into the sea. After a year, a woman rose from the water and announced herself as Manu's daughter. And so then Manu and his daughter repopulate the earth. Weird. There's a lot of incest in these flood repopulation stories, I'm realizing. Like Noah brought his relatives and all the animals on the arks. So then everyone on earth came from Noah's relatives? That's a pretty small gene pool. Actually kind of explains a lot. The Aztecs have a great flood story as well. In this version, Noah is called Cox, or sometimes Tata, and he and his wife get inside of a giant cypress tree instead of a boat. The god Titlaquan, I don't know how to say that, Titlaquan, we're going to go with that, seals them inside of this big tree. And he tells them that they could only eat 1 ear of maize each. That's it. 1 piece of corn, that's all they get. And then, this is kind of weird, instead of killing everyone else on Earth, the flood turns all the other humans into fish. And then after the flood, Tata and his wife disobeyed Titlaquan, sort of like Adam and Eve mixed with Noah's Ark here, and they ate the fish, which were the people, right? So they ate the fish, and so as punishment, Titlaquan, this god, he turns them into dogs. Keep writes, quote, "The story ends with the world essentially starting all over again, only this time with a hardy fish population and a couple of dogs," end quote. In the Ojibwe Chippewa Native American tribe, Noah's name is Wenabuzu, and he makes a raft of logs and sticks instead of like an ark. So this story has some fun animal sidekicks. Keep writes, quote, "The story goes that the Great Spirit was unhappy with man and created a great flood." Okay, same thing, right? The only survivor was a man named Wenabuzu, who had made a raft of logs and sticks for himself and other animals that were alive. They floated around for over a month, but the waters had not gone down. Wenabuzu decided that he was going to have to rebuild the earth, and he needed mud from the old world buried deep underwater, end quote. So he tries to recruit some of the animals that he had on his raft to help him go down and get this mud from the old world to start over with. A loon tries first, but the water's too deep. The loon fails. And then a beaver tries, but he also fails. And so they're all arguing about it on this raft. Him and all the animals, they're arguing who's going to do this. You can't do it. You can't do it. And while they're arguing, a little duck named Ajagad comes up and he volunteers to try to go down and get the old mud from under the water. But they tell him he's too small. There's no way you can do this. You're too small. They send him away, and they just keep arguing with each other. And as the sun goes down, they're still arguing, and they notice the body of a little duck floating on the surface of the water. It's this little duck, and Wenabuzu, he picks him up, and he has a tiny bit of mud in his beak, the old mud that he needs to rebuild the earth. So the little duck did it, despite his size. And so they revive him. He's okay. He flies off. He goes on his way. And Wenabuzu starts to shape the mud, which grows larger and larger. He needs a place to put it to start to rebuild this new earth from the old mud. And a snapping turtle named Mikanak offers his shell. So Wenabuzu forms the new earth on the back of the turtle. Not exactly the same story, diverges quite considerably there, but we do have the destruction of the old world with a flood and the rebuilding of a new world. In the Norse version, the earth is flooded with blood from a slain giant instead of water. Odin and his brothers Vili and Ve killed a giant named Ymir, whose blood flooded the whole earth. A frost giant, which is in Norse mythology, it's like he's not a god, he's also not a human. Frost giants are usually kind of like the antagonists to the gods, but not always, kind of complicated. So this frost giant, his name is Bergelmir, and his wife and him, they make an ark, right? Just like Noah. They're saved from this blood flood, and they repopulate the earth, right? Leave it to the Vikings to flood the earth with blood, not water, in their great flood myth, a blood flood. Has a nice ring to it. And so then the Aboriginal Australian version, completely opposite part of the world, that one actually might be my favorite. It involves a thirsty frog flooding the earth instead of an angry god. So the frog's name is Tiddalik, which is perfect. He's basically Tiddlywink, which is like the cutest frog name ever. He was so thirsty that he drank up all the water on earth. right? And this caused a massive drought that killed most things, most plants, and then of course most animals followed. And the surviving animals, the animals that survived the drought, they got together and they formed this sort of council. And they came up with an idea, a plan to fix this, right? They needed to make Tiddalik the frog spit all the water back out. And they decide that the only way to get him to do this is to make him laugh. Like, how cute is this story? So all the animals take turns trying to make Tiddalik laugh, and Keep explains, quote, Tiddalik couldn't hold back any longer. The frog started a low laugh that sounded like distant thunder, and when he opened his mouth, water came pouring out, flooding the land. The flood gradually subsided, and the land was verdant and peaceful again. End quote. Verdant. That's a good word. So what are the chances that all of these different groups of people all over the earth with incredibly different cultures, some of whom had no contact with one another at the time these stories emerged, would all tell virtually the same story? It's very interesting, and it definitely suggests some sort of worldwide flood situation. But then we have to look for the other thing, the better thing, right? The physical evidence. Because is there a chance that all of these different groups, the Aztecs and the Babylonians and the Aboriginals and the Norse, that they weren't all just experiencing the same worldwide flood? That instead, they're just all humans. And humans, no matter where or when they are, face similar challenges, like floods. The humans, no matter where or when they are, have the same psychology, that they make up similar stories to teach similar lessons and address similar fears. Is that possible? Yes. So is there any physical evidence of a worldwide flood? Or are we possibly talking about separate, smaller scale floods that affected all of these different groups and stirred them to eventually record a very similar story? As of right now, there doesn't seem to be any solid geological evidence of a worldwide flood as reported in the story of Noah's Ark. There's lots of evidence of various regional floods, even on, massive scales. But as far as the entire earth being covered in water at one time, no, there's no evidence of that. So I dug into an article written for the National Center for Science Education by Lawrence G. Collins, who is a petrologist, which is apparently a scientist who studies rocks, specifically like the origins of rocks and like the processes that form rocks over time. It was not a fun read, very heavy on the science. Dude might need to stick to rocks. He's not a writer. I mean, it's not like poorly written. It's just like this could make a whole lot more sense. But anyway, I did my best to decode it. Basically, Collins looks at these layers of rock that are all over Earth that, because of their composition, suggest they were once underwater. And then they were exposed to air at some point and dried out again. Okay, so there's kind of like a telltale sign of that. He's looking at oxidation, rust, that happens with exposure to the air. He's looking at evidence of cracks that form in mud when it dries out and sort of shrinks. And so he's saying these particular layers of rock, he calls them red beds because of the red color from the oxidation, the rust. He says these are evidence of times when that area was briefly underwater and then dried out again, evidence of a flood. And his point is, if what he calls the Noachian flood, this great worldwide flood, if that happened, you would expect to see this layer of red bed all over, marking the same incidents, evidence of a flood in rock layers from the same time. And that's not the case. It is found in many places, but at varying thicknesses and in between older and newer layers in the fossil record. So the evidence suggests many different regional floods happening at different times as opposed to one massive worldwide flood. Now, it's very likely that there was a massive widespread flood event in the area where Noah would have lived, ancient Mesopotamia. Did it cover the whole world in like a scientific geographical sense? No. But did it cover Noah's whole world in like the only world he knows about kind of way? Possibly. Collins explains the geography of that area between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. He talks in great mind-numbing detail about the elevation there and how it would have led to frequent flooding, which is also evident in the rock layers, and how people would have lived on natural levees that kept them above the recurring floods, right? Like they were prepared for this as like a regular thing. But he also points to evidence that there was a great flood in that area, probably around 2900 BC, which is about 5,000 years ago. He says, according to the evidence that I will not bore you with, this flood would have covered around 1.6 million square kilometers from the Persian Gulf up through Mesopotamia and into Syria and Turkey to the north. He says depths of these floodwaters would have reached up to 32 meters above these natural levees where people were living to avoid the regular minor flooding that took place. So that's significant. If they're already living on the highest point of the land and then that highest point gets submerged under 32 meters of water, that's over 100 feet, that's a major flood situation of biblical proportions. And the fact that the flood would have reached all the way into Turkey is significant because the various Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they all say that Noah's Ark eventually came to rest on Mount Ararat, which is in northeastern Turkey near its border with Iran. So let me take you to Mount Ararat, where something very interesting and of course controversial was found back in 1959 by a Turkish army captain and cartographer named İlhan Durupinar. So according to the reports, heavy rainfall and 3 separate earthquakes back in 1948, so like a decade before Durupinar goes poking around, had exposed an interesting formation about 29 kilometers south of Mount Ararat that was later observed by Durupinar. He goes, checking out the area, he sees this, so it's called the Durupinar Formation after him. And it very much looks like a large boat, a ship. In fact, it's actually almost the exact dimensions recorded for Noah's Ark, which is 157 meters long, 26 meters wide, and 16 meters high. So, people are immediately like, this guy found Noah's Ark. Here it is. Here's the boat right here, right near Mount Ararat where it was supposed to be. And it does look like a boat, right? And it's the right size. But, we need more than that. Is it a boat or is it not a boat? Well, according to the Jerusalem Post, a research group from California called Noah's Ark Scan has recently conducted scans, ground-penetrating radar scans there, that have revealed some promising results. So this article is from a month ago, so this research is fresh and it's still ongoing. The Jerusalem Post reports, quote, a new analysis of radar data has supposedly revealed central and lateral corridors that cross the vessel, and angular structures of up to 6 meters deep, which may represent rooms beneath a deck-like platform. The Noah's Ark scan team will verify whether the structures detected underground at the Durupinar site are of artificial or natural origin, end quote. So, results pending there, but they have found what looks like structures within the formation that are consistent with a boat. And they've also tested the soil there. The article says, quote, William Crabtree, a member of the research team, discussed their soil analysis, noting that organic matter was found to be double inside the formation compared to the surrounding soil. If you know soil science, as I am a soil scientist, you will understand that potassium levels, organic matter, and pH can all be affected by the decomposition of organic materials. If this was a wooden vessel and the wood had rotted over time, we would expect to see increased potassium levels, changes in pH, and higher organic content. And that's exactly what we find, Crabtree explained. According to Newsbomb, the team also noticed that the plants growing on the structure are of a different color compared to the surrounding areas, which Jones suggested could indicate an anthropogenic origin. This difference in plant color suggests that the underground structure has a different substrate, Jones noted. End quote. Jones is referring to independent researcher Andrew Jones, who is leading the Noah's Ark scan group with the ground penetrating radar. So did we find Noah's Ark 29 kilometers south of Mount Ararat? Maybe, but TBD. Research is still ongoing. There are a lot of people who believe it's just some kind of natural rock formation. But I mean, I think it's looking promising that it was something man-made, at least some kind of wooden structure. I don't know if it was a boat, but something possibly made of wood, which would suggest that it was made by humans. The Jerusalem Post concludes, quote, collaboration with Turkish universities and the use of technology such as deep penetration scanners and geochemical analysis could provide concrete answers about the nature of the underground structures at the Darupanar site. The researchers seek to gather more key data before implementing a preservation plan for the archaeological site. End quote. So yeah, TBD. There is another location not too far away from that with evidence of a massive flood event as well. And this one involves a familiar name. Like I actually talked about a couple of weeks ago in regards to the wreck of Titanic, Robert Ballard. So if you recall, Robert Ballard was the guy who discovered Titanic on the bottom of the North Atlantic back in 1985. He is a famed underwater archaeologist. Like, he's like the Beyonce of underwater archaeologists or whatever. He managed to breach the science nerd pop culture gap, which is something that few people have done. So he's pretty well known. So Ballard has turned his attention to the Black Sea. The Black Sea it's also near Turkey. It's to the north of Turkey, so it's not like a crazy distance from Mount Ararat and the Darupanar Formation. And the reason Ballard is focusing on the Black Sea is because he believes there may be evidence of an ancient civilization dating back to the time of Noah pre-flood beneath it. The Black Sea deluge theory came about back in the mid-1990s in response to a lack of Neolithic sites in northern Turkey, right? There's a time and a place where humans ceased to exist in that area. So, they wondered, well, what happened to them? And thus the Black Sea deluge theory was born, that catastrophic flooding occurred in that area when water from the Mediterranean Sea rushed in, possibly due to a rise in seawater when ice melted after the last ice age. So the main proponents of this theory are Columbia University oceanographers William Ryan and Walter Pittman. According to Hannah Fairfield in a Columbia University Record article from 1999, quote, Ryan and Pittman believe that the sealed Bosporus Strait, which acted as a dam between the Mediterranean and Black Seas, broke open when climatic warming at the close of the last glacial period caused ice caps to melt, raising the global sea level. With more than 200 times the force of Niagara Falls, the thundering water flooded the Black Sea, which was no more than a large lake, raising its surface up to 6 inches per day and swallowing 60,000 square miles in less than a year. As the Mediterranean saltwater replaced fresh water, it expelled a wave of human migration from what had been an oasis of fresh water within very arid lands, an exodus traumatic enough to be recorded in human memory as the Epic of Gilgamesh and the biblical story of Noah's Ark, the scientists said. End quote. This caught Robert Ballard's attention. In talking about the last ice age, he says in an article for ABC News, quote, where I live in Connecticut was ice a mile above my house, all the way back to the North Pole, about 15 million kilometers. That's a big ice cube. But then it started to melt. We're talking about the floods of our living history, end quote. According to the article, which is from 2012, Ballard and his team started looking for evidence of an ancient flood in the area of the Black Sea, and they seem to have found it. According to ABC News, quote, 400 feet below the surface of the Black Sea, they unearthed an ancient shoreline, proof to Ballard that a catastrophic event did happen in the Black Sea. By carbon dating shells found along the shoreline, Ballard said he believes they have established a timeline for that catastrophic event, which he estimates happened around 5000 BC. Some experts believe this was around the time when Noah's flood could have occurred. End quote. This is significant because what's now the salty Black Sea used to be a much smaller freshwater lake. That ancient shoreline Ballard found, those shells on that ancient shoreline below the now Black Sea, they once rested beside a comparatively small freshwater lake, which would have made a great place for humans to live. Freshwater? Are you kidding me? It was like an oasis until it flooded with salty water from the Mediterranean. So what would have happened? Well, anyone who survived that flood would have been forced to move out of that area, a diaspora of ancient peoples. And this was a crazy thing that had happened to them. This was a big event. This was a traumatic event. They weren't just going to stay quiet about it once they reached their new homes. Having lost their fresh water source, they likely moved on to live in surrounding areas, and they would have brought the story of the Great Flood with them. Doctors Ryan and Pittman, who first proposed the theory, they also suggested that these people, this exodus, brought with it new farming techniques, because around this same time that the area was thought to have flooded, we see major agricultural development taking place in surrounding areas. So what is going on with all of these different flood stories? Scientifically, geologically, logically, it does not appear that they're all referring to the same worldwide flood. Rather, smaller scale regional floods that left a lasting impact on people. When you look at where ancient civilizations spring up, they're pretty much all near substantial bodies of water or important rivers. We need water. We need it for a lot of reasons. We have to drink it to stay alive. We can eat the animals that live in it. We can use it for cooking and cleaning. We can use it for transportation and trade. We are basically nothing without water. And so that's why almost every single ancient civilization that we know of lived next to water. A consequence of that is also flooding. Because if you live next to a body of water, at some point you are going to experience some sort of flooding. And floods can be devastating, especially in ancient times when people didn't really understand science or weather, and they couldn't predict things like floods very well. Floods happen quickly and unexpectedly, and in an instant, your entire world is washed away. We can't live without water, but it'll kill you in a heartbeat too. So when you talk about writing a cautionary tale, a story that's supposed to teach people a lesson, to obey a deity and behave so that they don't get destroyed, a flood is a pretty great consequence to write into that story. Just literally, it works. It drives the point home nicely. And so it's not a shared worldwide flood that happened. It's a shared worldwide human condition. A realization of our collective fears and weaknesses and will to survive coming out through storytelling. The ancient Babylonians, the Christians, the Jews, the Muslims, the Hindu, the Buddhists, the ancient Chinese, the ancient Greeks, the Aboriginals, the Native Americans, the Aztecs, the Norse, these groups did not all experience one flood event in all of their various corners of the globe. What they experienced together, without realizing it, was being human. As much as we want to separate ourselves by nationality or belief system or culture or the color of our skin, we are all humans, and our experiences reflect that we are all one, together, experiencing what it is to be human. And that, my friends, might just be the real lesson of our shared Great Flood story. Thank you all so very much for listening to History Fix. I hope you found this story interesting and maybe you even learned something new. Be sure to follow my Instagram @HistoryFixPodcast to see some images that go along with this episode and to stay on top of new episodes as they drop. I'd also really appreciate it if you would rate and follow History Fix on whatever app you're using to listen and help me spread the word by telling a few friends about it. That'll make it much easier to get your next fix. Information used in this episode was sourced from the National Center for Science Education, ABC News, PBS, How Stuff Works, Wikipedia, the Jerusalem Post, the Columbia University Record, Mini Museum, and World History Encyclopedia. As always, links to these sources can be found in the show notes.